This video is sponsored by InVideo AI. The plan was never to actually do it. The last thing Vice Admiral Sir James Somerville wanted that summer of 1940 was to unleash his fleet on former allies, tearing through the French fleet at Mers-el-Kébir. Yet, after over 10 grueling hours of negotiation, they were at an impasse. Admiral Marcel Gensoul of the French Navy was insulted and infuriated by the betrayal. He refused to even meet the British negotiator. French sailors rushed to their battle stations. He signaled defiantly, "The French ships will defend themselves with force." The radio crackled with a chilling message from the Admiralty to Somerville. "If the French will not accept any of your alternatives, they are to be destroyed." He despised those orders. He was sure they would alienate any potential allies in the future, but as a military man, he was going to follow them anyway. Desperate, he extended the deadline again, hoping Gensoul's pride might give way before the unthinkable became unavoidable. Thousands of lives were on the line. Time ran out. A stern warning over the radio. "Settle matters quickly, or you will have reinforcements to deal with." French and Italian forces mobilized across North Africa, bearing down on his fleet. Somerville's blood ran cold. Against every instinct, he executed what Churchill would later call the most unnatural and painful decision of the war. A new force has emerged in the battle to create better AI videos. InVideo AI V3. This impressive update is your intelligence officer, your war correspondent, your combat camera operator, and your strategic planner, all consolidated into one formidable unit. InVideo AI V3 doesn't just provide you with a single-shot weapon, it's an entire content creation arsenal rolled into one, the only tool you'll need. Better yet, it's not just about editing existing footage. It's about generating entire videos from scratch that are instantly ready to be shared with your legions of followers. Ready to see this game-changing tool in action? We deployed InVideo AI V3 on a critical mission to produce some B-roll style footage of the Big Sur. In just a few minutes, this is what it delivered. A medal-worthy performance, wouldn't you agree? If you don't like something, just use an edit command like "use my voice." And that's not all it can do. Whatever type of content you have in mind, from relaxation videos to commercials, InVideo AI V3 is the hero you can always rely on, your most loyal ally. Just sit back and watch while InVideo AI V3 brings your ideas to life with sniper-like precision. It's a guaranteed victory. The good news from the front line is that, unlike many other AI video tools which have so far failed to materialize, InVideo AI V3 is going to be ready for action in just a few weeks. If you haven't deployed it yet, now's the time to mobilize. Follow the link in the description to try the current version for free and join our ranks. Better yet, with paid plans starting at just $20 per month, you can use our code WW250 to receive double the video creation minutes for your first month. Don't miss out on this major tactical advantage. Launch your content creation offensive with InVideo AI today. It was June 1940, and Europe was on its knees. In 6 weeks, Nazi Germany had torn through the continent, ripping apart everything in its path. France, Britain's longtime ally, had fallen, crushed under the weight of German panzers and Luftwaffe bombers. It wasn't just the loss of an ally. France's surrender meant a colossal navy, one of the most powerful in the world, was now up for grabs, lying there like a loaded gun for anyone to take. And Churchill knew precisely who'd want it. Winston Churchill, barely 2 months into his role as Prime Minister, saw the writing on the wall. Britain's very survival hinged on its control of the seas. He understood better than anyone what would happen if Germany got its hands on those French ships. With the German Navy combined with French firepower, the Nazis could own the waters. Britain would be isolated, a sitting duck for Hitler's war machine. As Churchill put it in his desperate final message to the French government, such an act would scarify their names for 1,000 years of history. After Dunkirk, Britain had barely enough troops left standing to call it an army, let alone fight off an invasion. They'd left everything behind: tanks, artillery, weapons, all abandoned on French shores. The only thing keeping Britain safe now was the seas separating it from the rest of Europe and the power of the Royal Navy. If Germany got its hands on the French Navy, that could change. The French fleet was massive, with battleships like the Richelieu and the Dunkirk, state-of-the-art battleships deliberately designed to outclass German vessels. It was supposed to cover the Mediterranean, keeping Italy's navy at bay and securing the southern flank of the Allies. But now, with France crumbling, that whole plan had fallen apart. Instead of reinforcing Britain's position, those ships were about to become its greatest threat. Churchill wanted them moved to British-controlled ports, where they'd be out of the Axis's reach. He pleaded and even proposed a Franco-British Union in a last-ditch effort to keep France in the fight. But by mid-June, it was clear the French spirit was broken. The government fled south, dragging what was left of the army with it, and Churchill saw his hopes slipping away. The reality was grim. If Britain lost the seas, it lost everything. No food, no supplies, no weapons. The Axis would choke them out. Churchill's only option was a gamble, an action that could threaten to turn the world against Britain. He gathered his war cabinet and made the call. They would take the French fleet, willingly or not. Operation Catapult was born. The order was handed to Vice Admiral Sir James Somerville, and no one, least of all Churchill, expected it to end well. Yet, Britain would fight to survive, even if it meant breaking the backs of yesterday's allies. Not everyone in the war cabinet could stomach Churchill's decision. There were endless objections and arguments against attacking what many still saw as an ally. It would surely alienate every other possible ally in a war that looked more grim by the day. Churchill understood this, and he knew destroying the French fleet had to be a last resort. On June 16th, he made a final trip to the remnants of the French government, now huddled in Tours. He met with Admiral Jean-François Darlan, head of the French Navy, and delivered a blunt message: "You must never let them get the French fleet." Darlan looked the Prime Minister in the eyes and promised that the ships wouldn't fall into German hands. It was an empty promise. By June 22nd, Churchill's worst fears came to life. France signed an armistice with Germany, and in the terms, the French Navy was to gather in specific ports to be demobilized under Axis supervision. Churchill had been First Lord of the Admiralty during World War I and knew firsthand that Britain's survival hinged on commanding the seas. Britain had intelligence from US Navy officers and their own First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, estimating that if Germany and Italy gained control of the French fleet, Britain would be outnumbered by nearly 50% in the Mediterranean. That alone could mean defeat, and Churchill knew it. There was no way around it. If the French wouldn't willingly move the fleet out of Axis reach, the British would force it to move or destroy it. For this mission, command fell to Vice Admiral Sir James Somerville, stationed at Gibraltar with his powerful squadron, Force H. His orders were explicit, yet for Somerville, this was a task he despised. A veteran of both wars, he understood the dark implications of what was about to happen. It felt like a betrayal. After discussing the situation with the former British naval attaché in Paris, Captain Cedric S. Holland, he wrote to the Admiralty, "After talk with Holland and others, Vice Admiral Force H is impressed with the view that the use of force should be avoided at all costs." Holland considers offensive action on our part would alienate all French everywhere they are. His misgivings were serious, but he was bound by duty. He would carry out the orders, even if it meant splitting the heart of the alliance. Somerville's Force H was a show of British might on the water. At its head was HMS Hood, a battle cruiser that could fire its 15-inch guns from over 16 miles away, backed by the battleships Valiant and Resolution, the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, and a flotilla of cruisers and destroyers. Together they wielded enough firepower to handle any resistance. Still, the idea was not to shoot on sight, but to deliver an ultimatum. Join the British, sail to neutral waters, or scuttle the ships where they lay. Refusal meant destruction. To Admiral Marcel Gensoul, the sight was both familiar and sickening. The British warships moving into view off the coast of Mers-el-Kébir on July 3rd were the same massive vessels he'd once called allies. Now, there was nothing friendly in their approach. This wasn't a gesture of support or camaraderie, it was a threat. The message was loud and clear before a word was even exchanged. Gensoul, a man whose pride matched his rank, was determined to uphold what was left of French pride and honor. At 6:30 a.m., the British destroyer Foxhound entered the harbor, carrying Captain Holland, the former naval attaché to Paris. He was a longtime friend of Gensoul, but today he was there to deliver an ultimatum. Lieutenant Dufay, Gensoul's flag lieutenant and a friend of Holland's, received the British officer at the harbor entrance. Swiftly, Dufay raced to the flagship Dunkirk to relay the message to Gensoul. As this unfolded, the French spotted vast numbers of warships that made Force H on the horizon. Gensoul refused to be swayed by ultimatums, especially under the threat of British guns. At 8:47 a.m., he made his stance clear. He ordered Foxhound to leave the harbor and sent word through Dufay that he would not meet with Holland. This was the first red flag for the British. Holland was an influential man and a friend of Gensoul. Refusing to even see him indicated negotiations would not be favorable. Undeterred, Holland took a launch to Dunkirk himself, hoping to change the Admiral's mind. Though rebuffed, he managed to have the written terms of the British position delivered to Gensoul. Churchill later wrote of the palpable emotion at the Admiralty. There was manifest emotion at the prospect of opening fire on those who had so lately been our comrades, but that there was no weakening in the resolve of the War Cabinet. Between 9:30 and 10 a.m., Gensoul sent a message to the French Admiralty. An English force composed of 3 battleships, an aircraft carrier, cruisers and destroyers. Before Oran has sent me an ultimatum. Sink your ships, 6-hour time limit, or we will constrain you or do so by force. Gensoul then ordered his fleet to prepare for action. To Holland, he sent a defiant message through Dufay. The French ships will defend themselves with force. Crucially, Gensoul's communication to his superiors omitted key details. He made no mention of the options to join the British, surrender the ships, or sail to neutral ports. This incomplete information, compounded by the French Admiralty's relocation from Bordeaux to Vichy, set the stage for a potential catastrophe. As the clock ticked towards confrontation, the French fleet stood ready, their resolve firm. The next few hours would determine the fate of these ships and potentially alter the course of the war. Somerville's fleet sat, waiting just beyond the reach of the French guns. Suddenly, over the radio, came a stark directive. If French will not accept any of your alternatives, they are to be destroyed. Vice Admiral Somerville checked his watch again. He'd given Admiral Gensoul every chance to avoid this fight. Hours had passed since Captain Holland's return from the negotiations, carrying nothing but a dismissal and, Somerville feared, a grim confirmation that Gensoul would refuse every British demand. The ultimatum clock was ticking, and Somerville, stationed aboard HMS Hood, could feel the weight of every second as he read through Churchill's orders once more. These were not orders he could delay much longer. The French ships were moored tightly at the long jetty, stern first to the mole, making them easy targets, but also giving them the leverage they'd need to make a fast getaway if Gensoul ordered it. Dunkirk and Strasbourg, the modern battle cruisers, were poised at the front, along with the older battleships Bretagne and Provence. Together with 6 destroyers, the French fleet's firepower was considerable, but Force H outclassed them. HMS Hood's 15-inch guns were primed, capable of hurling shells with destructive accuracy over 16 miles. If he ordered an attack, it would be devastating. Somerville watched the harbour, willing himself to wait. After all, an attack would sink not just ships, but lives and alliances too. He felt the heavy silence of the men around him. His officers knew the stakes and were ready, but their discomfort was palpable. The whole encounter had gone against every instinct Somerville held as a military man. Still, Somerville's orders from the Admiralty had been clear, and now the message crackled through the radio again, this time more urgent. Settle matters quickly, or you will have reinforcements to deal with. British reconnaissance had spotted French reinforcements mobilizing at Algiers, and the last thing Somerville wanted was a full-scale naval battle. There was also the matter of the Italian fleet. Somerville's fleet had been in the same spot for almost 10 hours, and if the French requested help from the Axis forces, this negotiation could turn into a disaster. His patience, already stretched thin, was now being tested to its limits. At 1:15 p.m., he sent one more ultimatum, signaling Gensoul to accept the terms by raising a white flag within an hour. However, as time passed and no flag appeared, Somerville granted yet another extension, pushing the deadline to 3:30 p.m. If there was any hope for peace, he was clinging to it. Somerville sent one last message to Gensoul. If none of the British proposals are acceptable by 17:30 British summertime, it will be necessary to sink your ships. Gensoul accepted the message from Captain Holland with the quiet resignation of a man who knew there was nothing left to say. He read the words, absorbed the meaning, and then rose, nodding once to Holland. His eyes lingered on the British captain as he turned and left, acknowledging the conclusion he had dreaded. Somerville had made his stance painfully clear, and Gensoul was prepared for the outcome. As Holland disembarked from Dunkirk at 5:25 p.m., he looked around, noting the somber movements of the French sailors. The men were at their battle stations, but their faces bore an expression somewhere between stoicism and disbelief. Many of them lingered on the upper decks, almost as if they believed that the worst was somehow still avoidable. Gensoul, meanwhile, climbed to the bridge of Dunkirk, his face drawn with the gravity of the situation. He turned to one of his officers, his voice carrying a finality that left no room for doubt. "I have done everything to gain time. Now it is finished." As HMS Foxhound pulled out of the harbour, laying mines in its wake, the stage was set. There would be no further delays. The next move belonged to the British fleet. At 5:54 p.m., Somerville's voice was tight as he issued the order. "Open fire." The words hung in the air, weighted with all the frustration, anger and regret that had built up over the long day. A second later, the Hood's 15-inch guns thundered into action, the noise ripping through the silence like an explosion, the shockwave rolling over the water and shattering the momentary stillness. Shells shrieked through the air, arcing toward the French fleet. The first salvo landed across Dunkirk and Commandant Tester, splashing the harbour in a violent spray of water and steel. In the French fleet, chaos erupted. Captain Collinet aboard Strasbourg called for full speed, his crew racing to cast off lines as the first shells smashed into the mole. The destroyers followed suit, smoke pouring from their funnels as they attempted a desperate escape. But the British were ready. Bretagne took a direct hit, and her magazine erupted in a horrific blast. The old battleship burned uncontrollably, shuddering as fires ripped through her hull, and within minutes, she capsized, taking 977 sailors to their graves. On Dunkirk, Gensoul's men fought to return fire, but the British shells were relentless. Dunkirk herself took multiple hits, her systems failing, and her crew worked frantically to turn her guns by hand. She managed only 4 salvos before being forced to the beach, her guns silenced. Provence, too, was hit in the stern, her captain ordering her beached to avoid blocking the harbour channel. Somerville held his fleet steady, watching as the French ships broke apart under the assault. After 9 minutes of relentless bombardment, he ordered a pause, hoping to allow the French sailors to abandon the ship. But the firing had stirred a desperate resolve in Captain Collinet, who saw a slim chance for survival. Strasbourg, with her engines at full power, pushed through the smoke and shell splashes, maneuvering through the mine-strewn waters and somehow slipping past the British line. She had a head start, but the British gave chase. Ark Royal launching her Swordfish bombers in a last-ditch attempt to stop her escape. The planes swooped in, braving anti-aircraft fire, but Collinet's maneuvering was too deft. Strasbourg, battered but intact, broke free into the open sea, disappearing toward Toulon under the cover of darkness. Back in the harbour, Gensoul's fleet lay in ruins. Fires raged across the water, thick smoke blotting out the sky as the French sailors fought to rescue survivors and control the flames. At 6:10 p.m., Gensoul sent his final signal. "All my ships are out of action. I request you cease fire." Somerville, weary and hollow-eyed, accepted the request but issued a stern warning. If he didn't see French ships scuttled, he would resume fire. As dusk settled over Mers-el-Kébir, the harbour was a smouldering wreck. Over 1,200 French sailors were lost, and their fleet was crippled. In that brief, savage bombardment, the alliance that once held Britain and France together had been torn apart. The smoke hadn't yet cleared from Mers-el-Kébir when the diplomatic fallout began to spiral. News of the attack spread like fire, and within days, relations between Vichy France and Britain shattered. Furious, the French government condemned the assault as a betrayal of the alliance they'd shared, ordering airstrikes on Gibraltar in retaliation. It was a sharp and bitter break. Less than a month before, France and Britain had been standing shoulder to shoulder against the Axis powers. Now, France's Vichy government stood closer to Germany, nudged into the Axis orbit by the trauma of Mers-el-Kébir. But not every French leader saw it that way. Charles de Gaulle, exiled and heading the Free French forces from London, made a decision following the attack. While most French officials were outraged, de Gaulle took a restrained stance, urging the French people to see the attack as a harsh necessity, a measure taken in desperation to prevent a greater catastrophe. Though he never condoned the bloodshed, de Gaulle's reaction marked a key moment of solidarity with the British, a sign that he understood the grim choices Churchill faced. On the other side of the Atlantic, the reaction was just as significant, but far more positive. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had been carefully weighing the level of US involvement, took notice of Britain's unyielding resolve. The operation, brutal as it was, showed him that Britain was in this fight to the last breath, that they would risk even the bitterest of decisions to protect their survival. Roosevelt's confidence in Britain solidified, and the doubts about Britain's endurance vanished. Shortly after Mers-el-Kébir, he approved the transfer of 50 US destroyers to the British Navy, a vital lifeline to bolster Britain's ability to defend itself against German threats. Churchill, however, felt the weight of Operation Catapult more deeply than anyone. Reflecting on it later, he described it as, "This was a hateful decision, the most unnatural and painful in which I have ever been concerned." It recalled the episode of the destruction of the Danish fleet in Copenhagen harbour by Nelson in 1801. It was a Greek tragedy, but no act was ever more necessary for the life of Britain and for all that depended upon it. Yet Churchill also recognised what the world saw in Britain after that day. As he recounted, "Here was this Britain which so many had counted down and out, striking ruthlessly at her dearest friends of yesterday. Britain, which had been dismissed by some as too weak to hold its ground, had just proven it would stop at nothing to survive. The cost was undeniable. Over 1,200 French sailors were lost, lives that once had stood with the British on Allied waters. Families were left grieving, their loved ones gone not to the Axis enemy, but to former allies. Yet, Britain had achieved its purpose. The French fleet was no longer a threat, and Britain had demonstrated unequivocally that it was ready to prevail." World War II on TV extends its highest commendations to InVideo AI for their support of this transmission. Remember, InVideo AI V3 is launching soon to be your most valuable asset in the content creation theatre. Check out the link in the description below to get your hands on this game-changing technology with paid plans starting at just $20 per month. And don't forget to use our code WW250 to double the video creation minutes in your first month.